The wind came without warning. It swept down from the northern ridge like something alive, something angry, tearing through the pines and scattering dead leaves across the frozen mud of the road. Elsie pulled her worn cloak tighter around her shoulders and kept walking, her boots making soft, defeated sounds against the ground. The leather was cracked at the left heel. She had stuffed it with dry moss 3 days ago, and the moss had long since turned to nothing. Each step sent a thin blade of cold straight up through her foot. She didn't stop. Stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant remembering. And remembering right now was the one thing she could not afford. The village of Ashvin lay 2 miles behind her, and she had left it with nothing but the cloak on her back, a half-eaten piece of hard bread tucked into her sleeve, and the particular kind of silence that follows a door being slammed in your face. The elder's wife had been clear. There is no place for a woman like you here. Not anymore. The words had been delivered without cruelty, which somehow made them worse. Pure fact. Cold as the wind. Elsie was 23 years old, and she had already been turned away from 4 villages in the span of 6 weeks. The forest thickened on both sides of the road. Ancient oaks pressed close, their bare branches interlocking overhead like the fingers of giants. The last gray light of afternoon filtered through in pale strips, laying shadows across the rutted path. Somewhere deep in the trees, a crow called once and went silent. She found the boys by accident. She almost stepped on them in truth. 2 small figures crouched behind the massive root of a fallen oak, pressed so tightly together they looked like a single creature. They couldn't have been older than 5 or 6. Identical faces, both pale with cold, both wide-eyed and absolutely silent. One had a cut above his eyebrow that had dried to a dark crust. The other was holding his brother's hand with both of his own, knuckles white. Elsie stopped. The boys stared at her. She crouched slowly, bringing herself to their level. Her knees ached from the cold. "Hey," she said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." Neither of them spoke. The one with the cut blinked slowly, like a small animal deciding whether to bolt. "Are you lost?" she asked. Still nothing. But the one on the left, the one holding his brother's hands, gave the tiniest shake of his head. No, not lost, hiding. Elsie's eyes moved instinctively to the tree line. The forest had gone very still. No wind now. No crow. The silence had a texture to it, something pressed and waiting, the kind of quiet that came just before something broke. She heard the arrow before she saw it. A sharp whistle through the air, coming from the east, and her body moved before her mind caught up. She threw herself sideways, arms spreading wide, putting herself between the boys and the sound. The arrow caught her in the left shoulder. The impact was enormous, far greater than she expected, spinning her half around and driving the breath from her lungs. She hit the ground hard, cheek against frozen earth, and the world tilted sideways. The boys made no sound. She registered that distantly. Why aren't they crying? Then the forest exploded. Men came out of the trees. No, not men. Figures that moved like men, but faster, too fast, with a fluid, predatory grace that made her stomach drop. 6 of them, 7, circling the road with weapons drawn. Swords, axes, short hunting blades. They were dressed in dark leather and fur, and they moved with the coordinated silence of wolves on a hunt. And then he came. He walked out of the trees last, and the others moved away from him without being asked, creating a path the way water parts around stone. He was tall, broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that seemed almost architectural, like a building designed to withstand pressure. His dark hair was loose, pushed back from a face that was severe and angular, and currently arranged into an expression so cold it made the winter air around him seem warm by comparison. His eyes found the boys first. Something moved through that coldness. Fast, violent, gone before it fully formed. Relief, maybe, or the shadow of it. Then his gaze dropped to Elsie. She was still on the ground, One hand pressed to her shoulder where the arrow jutted at an ugly angle. She was aware, in a very distant way, that she was bleeding. The warmth spreading through the cold fabric of her cloak felt absurd, almost generous, like a fire lit in the wrong room. She met his eyes. She didn't know why she didn't look away. It wasn't bravery. She was well past the point where bravery was useful. It was something else. Something almost involuntary, like the way you can't stop looking at lightning even when you know you should take cover. His eyes were dark, nearly black in the fading light, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with anger. It was something stranger than anger, something she didn't have a word for. She stepped in front of it, one of the men said from somewhere behind her. His voice was rough with disbelief. "My lord, she..." The arrow was already released. She moved in front of it. The tall man said nothing. He was still looking at her. Elsie became aware that her arm was shaking. The pain was arriving now properly, rolling in from the shoulder in slow, nauseating waves. She pressed her lips together and said nothing. One of the boys, the one without the cut, the one who had been holding his brother, pulled free and ran. Not away from the tall man. Toward him. He crossed the road in 6 small, furious strides and threw himself against the man's leg, arms wrapping around his knee, face pressed into the fur at his thigh. The man's hand came down immediately, large and certain, resting on the boy's dark hair with a gentleness that seemed to cost him something. His sons, Elsie realized. These are his sons. The other boy was still looking at her. He hadn't moved. His dark eyes, so much like his father's it was almost disorienting, were fixed on her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. He reached out slowly, small fingers brushing the back of her hand where it was pressed into the dirt. The touch was so light, so careful. She felt something tighten in her throat. "Get her up," the tall man said. His voice was low, controlled, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never once needed to raise it, carefully. "My lord, we don't know who she..." I said carefully. 2 of the men came to her sides. They were not rough, which surprised her. They lifted her with practiced efficiency, one supporting her uninjured arm, the other steadying her at the waist. She got her feet under her and stood, swaying slightly, the world doing something unpleasant at the edges. The tall man was 3 feet away now. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. Not just in size, but in presence. Something radiating off him like heat from a forge. He looked at the arrow in her shoulder with an expression she still couldn't name. Then he looked at her face. "What is your name?" he said. She should have been frightened. Any sensible person would have been frightened. She was bleeding, surrounded by armed men, in the middle of a forest road that led nowhere she wanted to go, and the man asking her name had the look of someone who had never in his life been told no. "Elsie," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "My name is Elsie." He held her gaze for one long, strange moment, and then he said something that made no sense at all. "You shouldn't have done that." The words were quiet, almost rough, like they'd been pulled out of him against his will. "You didn't know who they were." She blinked. "They were children," she said. "In the cold. Does it matter who they were?" The silence that followed felt enormous. Behind him, she saw one of his men go very still. Another exchanged a glance with the man beside him, fast, loaded with meaning she couldn't decipher. Even the boy still clinging to his father's leg had gone quiet, head tilting back to look up at the tall man's face. Adrian. She didn't know his name yet. Wouldn't know it for another hour. Looked at her like she had said something in a language he had not expected anyone to still speak. And then, so quietly she almost missed it, the second boy, the one who had touched her hand, crossed the frozen road and pressed himself against her uninjured side, just like that, without hesitation, without permission, as if he already knew her. The arrow in her shoulder throbbed. The cold pressed in from all sides. And Elsie stood in the middle of a forest road with a child against her side, and a king staring at her like she had just broken something open in him. And she understood, in some wordless, bone-deep way, that her life had just changed completely. She just didn't know yet whether it had changed into something survivable. They called him the Alpha King. Elsie learned this the way she learned most things in the hours that followed. In fragments, overheard through the fog of pain and cold, and the strange suspended state that comes when your body is managing something serious, and your mind has simply decided to observe from a distance. She learned it from the men who carried her, on a makeshift stretcher of cut branches, and a fur cloak that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, through the forest, and up a winding path she would not have found on her own in 100 years of searching. She learned it from the way they spoke around her, careful and low, using titles and half-sentences, filling in the gaps with deference and silence. She learned it from the way the trees eventually gave way to torchlight and stone, to the massive iron-banded gates of a stronghold that rose from the ridge like it had grown there, ancient and absolute. She learned it, finally, from the woman who met them at the gates. She was perhaps 50, solid and straight-backed, with gray-streaked hair pinned severely at her neck, and the eyes of someone who had spent decades watching people and cataloging what she saw. She looked at the stretcher. She looked at the arrow. She looked at Elsie's face with an expression that cycled through something complex before settling, surprisingly, into something that resembled respect. "Bring her to the East Wing," the woman said. Her name, Elsie would learn, was Marin. She served as the Stronghold's head healer, and had, by her own later admission, seen nearly everything. "And tell the Alpha King that I will need quiet and time, and that neither of those things is negotiable." From the stretcher, Elsie almost smiled. The arrow came out badly. Not because Marin lacked skill. She had more skill than any healer Elsie had ever encountered, working with a focus so complete it was almost frightening. But because the arrowhead had caught the edge of the shoulder blade on its way in, and what should have been a clean extraction became something longer and more complicated. Elsie lay on a wooden table covered in linen that smelled of dried lavender and older things, staring at the ceiling beams and breathed through it. "You're not screaming," Marin observed at one point. Not a compliment. More of a clinical notation. "Would it help?" Elsie asked. "No." A pause. The pressure shifted, and Elsie's vision went white at the edges for a moment. "But most people do it anyway." "I've had worse," Elsie said. Marin's hand stilled briefly, then continued. "That is either very brave or very sad," she said. Elsie didn't answer. The ceiling beams were old, dark with age, carved at the joints with shapes she couldn't quite make out from this angle. Animals, maybe. Or something older than animals. When it was done, her shoulder was bound tightly in clean linen, her arms secured against her chest, and she had been given something warm to drink that tasted of bitter herbs and honey and made the edges of everything soften considerably. Marin helped her sit up slowly, watching her face with those cataloging eyes. "The boys," Elsie said. "Are they all right?" Something shifted in Marin's expression. "They're with their father," she said. "They're fine." A pause. The cut on Caius's head was shallow. It's already closed. Caius. That was the one who had touched her hand. She filed the name away carefully. "And the other one?" "Cade." Marin folded her instruments into a worn leather roll with practiced efficiency. "He hasn't let go of his father since they came through the gates." Another pause, longer this time. "They haven't done that in a long time. Attached themselves to someone new." Elsie looked at her. "What do you mean?" Marin tied the leather roll closed and didn't answer directly. "You should rest," she said. "You've lost blood, and your body has had a significant shock. You're safe here tonight. We'll speak more in the morning." It was, Elsie noticed, an answer shaped like a non-answer. She recognized the form, had used it herself, many times, in many difficult conversations. She let it pass. She was given a small room off the east corridor, stone-walled and simply furnished, with a narrow bed and a fireplace that someone had already lit. The fire was real and generous, pushing warmth into every corner, and the blanket on the bed was thick wool, worn soft with age. Elsie sat on the edge of the mattress for a long moment, one-armed, her cloak finally removed, wearing a borrowed shirt 2 sizes too large and a pair of rough-spun trousers. She looked at her hands. They had stopped shaking. She took that as a good sign. She was nearly asleep when the knock came. It was quiet, almost tentative, which was strange given everything she had observed about this place and the people in it. She sat up. "Come in." The door opened, and it was not who she expected. It was Cade. He stood in the doorway in a nightshirt that was slightly too long, dark hair disheveled, feet bare on the cold stone floor. He was holding something, a small carved wooden wolf, worn smooth from handling, the kind of object a child carries everywhere until it becomes part of them. He looked at her with his father's eyes and said nothing. Elsie looked back at him. "You should be in bed," she said softly. He crossed the room and sat at the foot of her bed. Just like that. No hesitation, no asking. He pulled his feet up under him and held the wooden wolf in both hands and looked at the fire. Elsie watched him for a moment. Then she settled back against the headboard, her good arm resting across her knee, and looked at the fire too. They sat together in silence that was, somehow, entirely comfortable. After a while, she said, "Your feet must be freezing." He looked down at them. Then he looked up at her. And for the first time, he spoke. His voice was small and serious. "Father says the cold doesn't hurt us," he said. "Not really." Elsie said. "And what do you think?" He considered this with genuine gravity. "I think it does hurt," he said, "but in a different way than it hurts you." She nodded slowly. "That's a very honest answer." He looked at the fire again. A long pause. Then, "You jumped in front of the arrow." "I did." "Why?" She thought about it. Not performing thought, actually thinking, because he was asking seriously, and he deserved a serious answer. "Because I saw you before I saw anything else," she said finally. And it was the only thing that made sense. Cade turned the wooden wolf over in his hands, around and around, slow and rhythmic. "Caius said you smelled like home," he said quietly. "He said that before we even came back through the gates." Elsie went very still. "I don't know what that means," Cade added, with the careful honesty of a child who has decided that truth is more reliable than comfort. "But Caius is usually right about things." The fire crackled. Outside the small window, the wind had returned, pressing against the stone walls with a low, constant moan. The room held its warmth. A few minutes later, Cade was asleep, curled at the foot of her bed with the wooden wolf tucked under his chin. Elsie looked at him for a long moment. This small, serious, barefooted boy who had walked through a cold corridor to sit with a stranger, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt needed, not useful, not tolerated, needed. She pulled the edge of the wool blanket over him carefully, so as not to wake him, and lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling. "Caius said you smelled like home." She was still thinking about that when the door, which she had assumed was empty, shifted slightly. She turned her head. Adrian stood in the doorway. He was not wearing his weapons or his furs. A plain, dark shirt, sleeves pushed to the elbows. He looked like a man who had not slept in some time. His eyes went to Cade first, still assessing, something releasing in his expression when he confirmed the boy was breathing, and safe, and simply asleep. Then his gaze moved to Elsie. They looked at each other across the firelit room. His jaw was tight. There was something working behind his eyes, something she suspected he was very accustomed to keeping locked down, and that the locking was currently requiring more effort than usual. He said nothing. She said nothing. He looked at his son, asleep at the foot of her bed, clutching the wooden wolf. And something in his face, just for a moment, just in the firelight, broke open. Then it closed again. Controlled, sealed, returned to whatever place he kept it. He looked at her one last time. Then he pulled the door shut quietly and was gone. Elsie turned back to the ceiling. Her shoulder ached. The fire was warm. Somewhere in the walls of this ancient stronghold, the wind found cracks to sing through. She had come to this forest with nothing. A broken boot, a piece of hard bread, and nowhere left to go. She had no idea what she had arrived at, but she was beginning to suspect it was not nothing. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of morning that arrives without apology, pressing pale light through the narrow windows and laying it across the stone floor in thin strips. Elsie woke to find the foot of the bed empty. Cade was gone, the wool blanket folded with surprising neatness for a 6-year-old, the wooden wolf left behind on the mattress like a small, deliberate gift. She looked at it for a moment. Then she got up. Her shoulder announced itself immediately, a deep, structural ache that radiated down her arm and up into her neck when she moved too quickly. She had known worse. She dressed slowly, the borrowed clothes too large but clean, worked her feet into her cracked boots, and stood at the small window looking out over the stronghold's inner yard. It was larger than she had realized in the dark. Stone buildings arranged around a central ground, a well at the center, stables along the far wall. Men moved below with the particular economy of people who have routines and keep them. 2 of them were sparring near the stables, wooden practice swords cracking in the cold air. A boy of perhaps 12 was hauling water, breath misting in great clouds. Horses stamped and shifted behind their gates. And in the far corner of the yard, half obscured by the shadow of the eastern wall, Adrian stood with his back to the stronghold. He was still. Completely still, in the way that very large, very controlled things sometimes go still, not resting, but waiting. His hands were at his sides. He was looking at the ridge beyond the wall, at the dark line of the forest against the pale sky. Even from 3 floors up, she could read the tension in his shoulders. She turned away from the window before he could turn and find her watching. Marin found her in the corridor 20 minutes later and escorted her, without preamble, to a room off the great hall that served as a combination of storage space and breakfast room, with a long table currently occupied by 3 of Adrian's men and a quantity of dark bread, cold meat, and hard cheese that made Elsie's stomach contract sharply with hunger. She ate with more restraint than she felt, because she had learned, across 6 weeks of closed doors and cold roads, that desperation made people uncomfortable, and that visible hunger was treated as a kind of accusation. The men at the table were not unfriendly. They were cautious, which was different. They glanced at her shoulder, at her face, at each other, in a rotation that communicated volumes without producing a single word. The largest of them, a man with a red beard and the build of someone who had been hitting things professionally for 30 years, finally said, "You're the one who stopped the arrow." "Yes," Elsie said. He looked at her steadily. "You didn't know who the boys were." "No, but you knew what the arrow would do." "Yes," she said again. Redbeard was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and pushed the plate of cheese closer to her side without comment. She took a piece and didn't thank him effusively, because men like this found effusive thanks embarrassing, and she had learned that too. His name was Gareth. She learned the others: Finn, quiet and watchful, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, and Rowan, younger than the rest, who kept looking at her like she was a problem he was trying to solve mathematically. They were the Alpha King's inner circle, or part of it. She understood this without being told. The way they occupied the room said everything about what they were to the man who commanded it. She was halfway through her second piece of bread, when the door opened, and both boys came in. Caius first. Always first. With the cut on his forehead reduced overnight to a thin, dark line. He saw Elsie and stopped walking. Then, with the absolute certainty of a child who has made a decision and sees no reason to second-guess it. He came and sat beside her. Close. Closer than was strictly necessary given the length of the bench. Cade followed and sat on her other side. Gareth's red eyebrows rose approximately half an inch. Finn went very still. Rowan's mathematical expression shifted into something more like astonishment. Elsie looked down at the two dark heads on either side of her and felt the same tightening in her throat she'd felt the night before, when Cade had pressed his small fingers against the back of her hand in the frozen road. She looked back at her bread and said nothing. "Are you staying?" Caius asked. Direct, no preamble. His father's cadence in a child's voice. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Father said you could," he said. "I heard him tell Marin." Across the table, Gareth made a sound that was not quite a cough. "That's between your father and me," Elsie said carefully. Caius accepted this with equanimity and reached for a piece of bread. Cade, on her other side, said nothing, but leaned almost imperceptibly closer. She felt the small warmth of his shoulder against her arm. She did not pull away. The conversation with Adrian happened that afternoon. Marin had said he will want to speak with you today, in the tone of someone delivering a weather report. Factual, inevitable, unconnected to personal opinion. Elsie had nodded and spent the intervening hours learning the shape of the stronghold, walking its corridors slowly with her arm bound and her eyes open, cataloging exits and layouts with the particular attention of a woman who had spent years making sure she always knew where the door was. He found her in the library. It was a small room, warmer than the corridors, shelves of bound manuscripts and loose parchment lining every wall, a single window overlooking the inner yard. She had been looking at the titles without touching, because the books were old and clearly valued, and she had learned early that other people's valued things should be observed with respect. He knocked once on the open door, which she had not expected. She turned. He looked better than he had in the doorway last night, in the sense that he had slept, or at least rested. The severity was still there, written into every line of his face, but it sat differently in daylight, less like a wall and more like a habit. He was wearing a dark tunic, a heavy fur-lined vest, boots that had seen considerable use. There was a scar along his jaw, pale and old, that she hadn't noticed in the forest. He came into the room and stood across the small reading table from her, and they regarded each other for a moment. "How is your shoulder?" he said. "Functional," she said. "Marin is skilled." "She is." A pause. "I owe you a debt," he said. The words came out measured, deliberate, like they had been assembled carefully before being spoken. "My sons were outside the walls without permission. There are people who want them used against me. The archer was one of them. You put yourself between my children and an arrow without any reason to do so." "I told your son why," she said. "They were children. That was reason enough." Something moved through his expression. Most people would have run. "I'm not most people," she said. Not with pride, just as a statement. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved over her face with that same strange intensity from the forest, that quality of attention that felt less like scrutiny and more like recognition. Like someone staring at a word they should know but can't quite place. "Where are you from?" he said. "Originally, a village called Embers Ford, 3 days east of here." She kept her voice level. "I left 6 years ago." "Why?" "My father sold my work contract to a man who wanted a housekeeper and a punching bag." She said it simply, because it was simply true. "I declined." Adrian's jaw tightened, a small movement, quickly controlled. "And since then I've worked where work could be found," she said. "Healer's assistant, cook, barn hand, seamstress, whatever was needed." She met his eyes. "I'm capable. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I don't cause trouble." "You took an arrow for 2 children you'd never met," he said. "That tends to cause trouble. Or solve it, depending on your perspective. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. It had a different texture. He was looking at her as though she had said something unexpected again, and she was beginning to understand that this happened with him, that something she said produced this reaction in him, this brief, unguarded quality, before the control reasserted itself. "I'm offering you a position," he said finally, "in this household, to help with the boys." He paused. "They need consistency, someone who is present. Their mother has been gone for 2 years, and I am often—" He stopped, started again. "I am not always available in the ways that they need." Elsie looked at him carefully. There was something beneath the words. Not an excuse. This was not a man who made excuses, but something closer to confession. The briefest opening of a door that was otherwise permanently sealed. "Why me?" she said. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "I don't." He looked at her steadily. "But Cade slept at the foot of your bed last night and left you his wolf." She blinked. "I was going to return it." "He's never given it to anyone," Adrian said quietly. "Not once. In 6 years." The fire in the small grate popped softly. Outside the window, the yard was going dim as clouds thickened overhead, promising snow before nightfall. Elsie thought about the road behind her, the 4 closed doors, the cracked boot and the hard bread and the particular silence that follows a life narrowing down to almost nothing. She thought about Cade's hand on hers in the frozen mud, about Caius pressing close at the breakfast table, about this ancient stronghold with its carved ceiling beams and its generous fires, and its deeply complicated king looking at her like she was a word he couldn't stop trying to remember. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." Something in his face shifted. Subtle, almost invisible. But she saw it, and she couldn't tell yet whether what she'd seen was relief, or the beginning of something far more dangerous. Snow came that night, and stayed for 3 days. It transformed the stronghold into something almost gentle, softening the hard angles of the stone walls, filling the yard with quiet, turning the ridge beyond into a white curve against a white sky. The boys loved it with the complete, uncomplicated devotion that children bring to weather. They built things and destroyed things and came inside with red cheeks and frozen fingers and demanded hot broth with the absolute confidence of people who have never once been refused it. Elsie watched this and made note of it. The confidence. The way Caius argued loudly about everything, and Cade observed everything silently in both of them, in their entirely different ways, angled themselves toward her throughout the day like plants toward a window. It was not neediness. They were too much their father's sons for that. It was something more deliberate. A decision, made and remade continuously. She had been in the stronghold for 5 days when she understood that she was being watched. Not by Adrian. His attention was its own distinct thing, something she was learning to recognize the way you learn to recognize a particular sound in a building, a creak or a draft that tells you something about the structure beneath. This was different, cooler, more calculated. His name was Sivan. He was Adrian's second in command, a lean, precise man of perhaps 40, with close-cropped silver hair and light eyes that never quite settled. He had not been among the men in the breakfast room. He had been, she realized in retrospect, notably absent from every casual gathering she had encountered in her first days. She met him formally on the 5th day, in the corridor outside the great hall, when he stepped into her path with the smooth deliberateness of someone who has timed his movement exactly. "You're the woman who stopped the arrow," he said. A greeting shaped like a statement, shaped like an accusation. "Yes," Elsie said. He looked at her with those light, settling eyes. "Remarkable instinct," he said, "for someone with no apparent connection to this house." "Children don't require connection," she said. "They require protection." He tilted his head slightly. "And yet here you are, 5 days later, living in the East Wing, taking meals with the Alpha King's sons." A pause, perfectly weighted. One wonders how a woman wandering a forest road alone ends up so comfortably installed. Elsie looked at him steadily. She had met men like this before. Men who built their power from insinuation, who used the shape of a question to plant the weight of an accusation. She had learned across years of difficult rooms that the worst thing you could do was flinch. One could ask, she said pleasantly, and receive a straightforward answer. That option is also available. Something moved in his expression. Not quite respect, more like recalibration. I ask because I care about the safety of this house, he said. So do I, she said, since I've been in it. She stepped around him and continued down the corridor. Her heart was beating faster than her face had shown. She kept her pace even until she turned the corner, and then she stopped and pressed her back against the cold stone wall and breathed carefully. The shoulder ached. She pressed her good hand against it and stared at the ceiling. One wonders how a woman wandering a forest road ends up so comfortably installed. She had wondered the same thing. She was still wondering. She found Maren in the still room that evening, grinding something that smelled of pine and something sharper underneath, medicinal and dark. The older woman looked up when Elsie came in and said nothing, which was, she had learned, Maren's version of an invitation. Elsie sat on the low stool near the workbench. Tell me about the boy's mother, she said. Maren's hands didn't stop moving. The grinding was rhythmic, patient. What makes you ask? Adrian said she's been gone 2 years. The boys don't speak of her. Elsie paused. And Cade carries a wolf that no one gave him, and Caius argues about everything as though he's trying to fill a room that got too quiet. Maren set down the pestle. She looked at Elsie with those cataloging eyes, and whatever she found there seemed to satisfy some internal requirement, because she sighed once and said, her name was Sira. She was from the Western Pax. The match was political. Alliances, territory, the usual architecture of power. A pause. She was not cruel. She was simply absent. Even when she was present, she was absent. The boys were raised largely by the household. And when she left, she didn't leave. Maren's voice was flat, careful. She was taken. A rival faction. Men who wanted Adrian's territory and thought his family was the lever to move him. She picked up the pestle again. She didn't survive the attempt to recover her. Elsie was quiet for a moment. The same faction that sent the archer into the forest. Maren looked up sharply. What makes you say that? Adrian said there are people who want the boys used against him, Elsie said. An archer who targets children in the forest isn't a random event. It's a message. The older woman was still for a long moment. Then she said quietly, You're perceptive. I've had to be, Elsie said. Maren nodded slowly, something settling in her expression. Yes, she said. The same faction. They've grown bolder in recent months. Seven believes. She stopped. Seven believes what? Elsie said. Maren looked at her. Seven believes the infiltration has come closer than anyone wants to admit. That someone inside the stronghold has been providing information. Her voice was low now. The grinding stopped entirely. He's been watching everyone who's arrived in the last 6 months. The cold in the room seemed to deepen. One wonders how a woman wandering a forest road ends up so comfortably installed. He thinks it's me, Elsie said. Maren didn't deny it. He thinks it could be anyone, she said carefully. But yes, you arrived at a convenient moment. Elsie stared at the workbench. The ground herbs were dark and fine, and they smelled of pine and something older. She thought about the road, the closed doors, the cracked boot, the absolute absence of anyone who might have sent her here for any reason other than pure, catastrophic luck. I have nothing, she said quietly. I came from nothing. I'm going nowhere that anyone would benefit from knowing about. She looked at Maren.
I am exactly what I appear to be. That's either reassuring or useless,
depending on what you need. Marin looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the pestle and said, I know that. A pause. Adrian knows that too. Does he? Why do you think you're still here? She was coming back from the still room when she heard them. The great hall was dark at this hour, the long tables empty, the fire burned down to deep orange coals. She had been about to pass the entrance when she heard Adrian's voice, and something in its quality, a tautness she hadn't heard before, something strained beneath the control, stopped her feet. She didn't enter. She stood in the corridor, just outside the pool of firelight, and listened. The report came in this afternoon. Gareth's voice, low and heavy. 3 of our scouts on the northern pass. They found the camp. 7. It's not a small operation anymore. They have numbers. Organized supply lines. This isn't a faction. It's a force. A silence. How long? Adrian's voice. A week. Maybe less before they're positioned to move. Another silence. Longer. When Adrian spoke again, his voice was very quiet and very controlled, and both of those qualities somehow made it more frightening than shouting would have been. The boys don't leave the walls. Not for any reason. Double the interior watch, and bring me everything we have on their command structure. There's something else. Seven's voice now, smooth and precise. The woman. The air in Elsie's lungs went very still. She arrived the same week the archer was positioned, Seven continued. She inserts herself with the children immediately. She asks Marin about the boy's mother, about internal security. She's mapping the stronghold. I've watched her do it, Adrian. She walks the corridors. She counts the guards. A long pause. She counts the guards because she's been turned away from 4 villages in 6 weeks, and she's making sure she knows where the exits are. Adrian's voice was flat. I know why she does it. You don't know her, Sivan said. I know enough. You know what she wants you to know. A pause. I'm asking you to consider, just consider, that the timing is not coincidental. That someone clever enough to plan an operation of this scale is clever enough to send a woman ahead of it. A sympathetic woman. One who takes arrows for children. The silence that followed was enormous. Elsie's back was against the cold stone wall. Her shoulder was throbbing. She was not breathing. Leave it, Adrian said finally. His voice had changed. It was back behind the wall now, fully controlled, fully sealed. I'll handle it. Adrian. I said leave it, Seven. Footsteps. Seven leaving through the far door. Then Gareth, quieter, his heavy tread receding down the corridor. And then silence. Just the low crackle of dying coals. Elsie stood in the dark corridor for a long moment. Then she pushed off the wall and walked back toward the east wing. Her footsteps quiet on the stone. Her mind turning over everything she had heard with the slow, methodical care of someone who understands that the ground beneath them has just shifted and that the next step needs to be placed with extraordinary precision. She had nowhere to go. That was still true. But she understood now that staying required more than Adrian's word. It required proof. And she had no idea yet what form that proof would take, or what it would cost her to find it. The proof came looking for her before she could go looking for it. She had been in the stronghold for 11 days when Caius woke in the night screaming. It was not a nightmare scream. She had heard those, thin and fading, the kind that dissolves when a hand touches a shoulder and a voice says you're safe. This was different. Sharp and sustained, the scream of a child in genuine pain. Elsie was on her feet and moving before she was fully awake, her body making the decision independently, crossing the corridor and pushing through the boy's door with her heart already at a full run. Caius was sitting up in bed, both hands pressed to his temples, his face white and sheened with sweat. Cade was beside him, arms around his brother, eyes wide and frightened in a way she had not seen before. And Cade, she had learned, was not easily frightened. The candle on the bedside table was still burning. Someone had left it for them. Caius. She was at his side immediately, her good hand on his face, tilting it toward her. His skin was burning. Look at me. Look at my face. He found her eyes. The screaming stopped, replaced by ragged breathing. There you are, she said quietly. I've got you. Tell me what hurts. His head, Cade said tightly. It started an hour ago. I was going to come get you, but he said no. And then it got worse. An hour, she repeated. She pressed careful fingers along Caius's jaw, his neck, behind his ears, reading the heat and tension there the way Marin had shown her years ago in a healer's cottage 3 villages east of nowhere. Why didn't you call for someone sooner? He doesn't like people to see, Cade said. His voice was flat with the particular flatness of a child translating a rule he has memorized but doesn't fully understand. He says Father doesn't like it when we're weak. Something cold moved through Elsie that had nothing to do with the night air. She kept her expression steady. Your father, she said carefully, would want to know if you were in pain. That's not weakness. That's information. Caius made a sound against her palm. Not agreement, exactly. More like the sound of someone hearing a thing they want very badly to believe. She got Marin. The older woman came quickly, assessed quickly, and pronounced it a fever breaking. Something that happened, she said, with children of their kind, a particular internal process that produced pain and heat before it resolved. Not dangerous, but not comfortable either. Stay with them, Marin said to Elsie, gathering her things. The fever will peak and then drop. It should be over before morning. Elsie stayed. She sat between the 2 beds, a damp cloth in her good hand for Caius's forehead. Cade's small fingers wrapped around her other wrist in the dark. She told them a story, something she invented as she went, about a girl who found a door in the side of a hill and what was on the other side of it, and kept her voice low and steady and present. And Caius's breathing gradually slowed, and the heat in his face gradually lessened, and somewhere around the 3rd hour, Cade's grip on her wrist loosened as he slipped back into sleep. She was still sitting there, the candle burned low, when Adrian appeared in the doorway. He had been told, she supposed, or he had heard. He stood very still, looking at his sons, both breathing, both settled, the worst of it over. And she watched his face do something she had only glimpsed before in fragments. The wall came down. Not all the way, not permanently, but enough. Enough to see what was underneath it. He loved them so fiercely it looked like pain. He crossed the room and crouched beside Caius's bed, one hand resting on the boy's dark hair, and stayed like that for a long moment. Then he straightened and looked at Elsie. Thank you, he said. Quiet, direct. The 2 words carrying more weight than most speeches. He said you don't like it when they're weak, she said softly. Adrian went very still. I'm not accusing you, she said, keeping her voice low, careful. I'm telling you what he believes, because he held a fever for an hour without calling for help because of it. The silence was long. His jaw was tight, his eyes on his son's sleeping face. I never said that to them, he said finally. His voice was rough in a way she hadn't heard before. I know, she said. But they heard it somewhere. Children always do. He looked at her. The firelight was very low, the candle almost gone, and in that near dark his face was stripped of its usual architecture. Just a man in the dark, sitting with something he hadn't known he'd let happen. I'll speak to them, he said. Good, she said simply. She found the proof 3 days later, entirely by accident, in the way that consequential things often arrive, not through searching, but through being in the right corridor at the wrong time. She had been taking a tray back to the kitchen after the boys' midday meal, navigating the back passage behind the great hall, when she heard Seven's voice through the gap in the storage room door. Low and quick,
the cadence of someone compressing information under time pressure. She stopped. She should have kept walking. She knew this even as her feet refused to move. "The West Gate," Sevan was saying. "The third night watch. Tell them the guard rotation changes at the second bell. The new configuration leaves the postern unattended for 12 minutes. A pause. Someone else's voice, too low to catch words. Then Sevan again. "It's enough. They only need 6 minutes. Elsie set the tray down against the wall with absolute silence, and walked, did not run, back the way she had come. Her mind was very clear. Strangely, completely clear, the way it had been when she'd heard the arrow and moved without thinking. The noise and doubt and careful navigation of the last 11 days stripped away, leaving only the essential shape of the moment. Sevan was the infiltration. Sevan, who had been watching her. Sevan, who had stood in Adrian's great hall and pointed at her and said, "Consider the timing." The man building the case against her was the one who had built the threat she was supposedly part of. She found Gareth. He was in the armory, alone, running a whetstone along the edge of a short sword with the focused patience of a man who treats his tools as a form of prayer. He looked up when she came in. His expression shifted when he saw her face. "I need you to listen to me," she said, carefully, "and I need you to decide quickly whether you trust me enough to act on what I'm about to tell you, because we may not have much time." Gareth set down the whetstone. "Talk," he said. She talked. What followed happened fast, the way true emergencies always do, in compressed, irreversible time, each action collapsing the distance to the next. Gareth went to Adrian. Adrian's face, when Gareth brought her to him, and she repeated everything word for word, was completely still in the particular way of a man who has just had a suspicion he refused to fully form, confirmed in the worst possible way. He looked at her. "You're certain?" "The West Gate, third watch. Postern unattended for 12 minutes at the second bell." She held his eyes. "I'm certain." Sevan was found attempting to leave the stronghold before the hour was out, a sealed message on his person addressed to a name that Gareth recognized, the commander of the force on the northern pass. The man Adrian's scouts had found a week ago, organized and positioned and waiting. They had been waiting for the gate. Sevan was contained. The guard rotation was changed. Word was sent to the northern scouts. And in the hours that followed, as the stronghold reorganized itself around the new reality of what had been living inside it, Elsie sat in the library with the door open and the fire lit and Cade's wooden wolf in her hands, and waited. Adrian came to her near midnight. He stood across the reading table from her, exactly as he had 11 days ago, when he had offered her a position in his household. He looked at the wolf in her hands, then at her face. "Sevan has been feeding them information for 8 months," he said. "Routes, schedules, the boys' patterns outside the walls." His voice was controlled, barely. The archer in the forest wasn't opportunistic. It was specifically timed. They knew the boys would be out that afternoon, because Sevan told them. Elsie said nothing. She turned the wooden wolf over in her hands, once. "You could have told me what you overheard and said nothing else," he said. "Kept your position secure. Let me handle the rest." "Yes," she said. "Instead, you gave Gareth everything immediately. Specific words, exact details." He paused. "You knew it would either save you or condemn you, depending on whether we believed you." "I knew that," she said. "Why?" She looked up at him. "Because this is your house," she said. "And your sons are in it. And I have been in it for 11 days, and I—" She stopped. Started again, more carefully. "I stopped being a stranger here somewhere around the 3rd day. I don't entirely know when it happened. But it did." The silence stretched between them, warm and complicated. Adrian moved around the table. Not fast, measured, deliberate, and crouched in front of her chair so that for the first time since the forest road, they were at the same level. His eyes, up close, in the low firelight, were not black as she had thought. They were very dark brown, and they were looking at her with that expression she had spent 11 days trying to name. She had a name for it now. Recognition. "My sons think you smell like home," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "Cade told me." "Wolves know their mates before their minds do," he said. "The boys sensed it before I let myself." A pause, something working in his jaw. "I have been letting myself for 11 days and fighting it for 11 days in equal measure." Elsie looked at him steadily. Her heart was doing something large and ungoverned behind her ribs. "Why?" she said. "Because the last time I trusted what I felt, I failed to protect someone I was responsible for," he said. Low, raw, the words clearly costing him. "And I decided I would not trust it again." "That's not trust you lost," she said softly. "That's grief you're still carrying." He was very still. "I'm not her," Elsie said. "I'm not a political arrangement. I'm not something to be managed or protected from a distance." She held his eyes. "I'm a woman who walked out of a forest road with nothing and jumped in front of an arrow because it was the right thing to do, and has been trying to figure out why this place feels more like home than anywhere I've ever been." The fire settled in the grate, a soft collapse of coals. Adrian reached out slowly and covered her hand, the one holding the wolf, with his own. His hand was large and warm, and entirely certain. "I know why," he said. And this time, he didn't pull the door closed.